Welcome everyone. Appreciate you guys coming out. Always on a Thursday afternoon, at least and when it's sunny on a November day, it's hard to get in here, but we appreciate you guys being here. So we're lucky to have a great speaker here with us today. Peter Doms is someone from Michigan who has a special place in my heart as a Michigander. I lived there for a little while, and Peter and I went to Western Michigan University, so I'm always happy to have a fellow Bronco around. So anyway, we're lucky to have him. Peter has a long history of doing a lot of great work with organizations and helping them identify goals and structure and how they want to move forward, and how to look at the science of behavior analysis to apply it to organizations. And his work, at least from my perspective, precedes his reputation. He was telling me earlier he wishes that he had a good enough reputation that he could just show up in jeans and not have to wear a suit all the time. I thought he fit that profile already, but he's a little too humble for that. So anyway, we're happy to welcome Peter with us today and look forward to his discussion about strategic planning.
Thank you for the invitation to be here. I really appreciate that. I had the pleasure of working with some of you already over the past year or so. And just this morning we had a leadership team meeting, and I was blown away by the progress you're making with respect to the rollout, looking at the goals and the implementation. It's going really well. So you're doing some things that other organizations take longer to do. So I'm really happy to be there and talk to you. So also appreciate a great tour of your facilities. That was nice. And finally, I appreciate coming from Michigan is that we have 74 degrees outside. So, which of course then is a challenge because probably a lot of you already had a work day, and there's things you got to do outside in the yard and get ready for the fall. So I appreciate you being here, and our goal is that this time will be worthwhile for you. Just one note, I just want to go through this presentation. There will be one short activity somewhere in the middle or so, and then if you can hold your questions to the end, that would be great, and then we'll see how we end up. Sean said I had 2.5 hours, so we're 10 minutes into that. So without further ado, in his book, The Advantage, best-selling author Patrick Lencioni, this has a delay, I'm sorry. So in his book, The Advantage, best-selling author Patrick Lencioni talks about the organizational health, and that it trumps everything else in business. According to Lencioni, organizational health is more important than in winning against the competition than it is, for example, strategy, marketing, structure. It is the differentiator that sets organizations apart. Lencioni is well versed with what is organizations. He wrote the book, 5 Dysfunctions of a Team, and you may have heard of Death by Meeting. So he's really into the business world. He's not a behavior analyst, neither is he an OBMer. But his message about organizational health really resonated with me, and I want to share some of that with you today. And I think it's also important for anybody who leads an organization, a function, or team, or people. The concept of clarity is extremely important. So clarity refers to the notion that leaders in an organization define clarity with respect to what the purpose of the organization is, talking about where are we going and how do we know that we get there, and drive this all the way down to all levels of the organization. So after you create this clarity, it is critical that leaders at all levels really over-communicate that clarity and reinforce it in the systems that they have set up. I'm looking at the screen here because, okay, there you go. So you may wonder what clarity has to do with the talk about OBM, about systems, about strategic planning, the topics of our conversation today. And what I want to share with you is what clarity can do. So let me show you just one example. So what you see on the screen is what my clients call a bubble diagram. I was working with a CMH, and they were tasked with putting together what they call a system of care. So they had to work with the criminal justice system, or juvenile justice, mental health, education, and child protective services, to provide a system that allows families to navigate it without going from one place to another, don't tell the story 10 times, just go right in there. And they also had to take their presentations on the road to service clubs, to other community organizations and so on, and say, here's what we have to create. And when they brought me in to help them with some planning, they said, we just can't get our handle around what it is that we want to communicate. We know, kind of have an idea what the system's supposed to look like, but when we take the slide somewhere, people just don't get it, and we don't even understand it. It shows all the elements, but it is not really clear to us. So this is not an example of clarity. So what I want to do is show you a systems thinking model that we use to apply that clarity to the organization, to the new system that they were creating. And it's a systems model that I will share with you later today, and we'll talk about how you can use that in your presentation. So on this slide has the same information that was in the bubble diagram, but now it's much clearer. Now you can talk about it. It shows at the top who the system is serving, youth with SED and parents and families. It talks about inputs. It talks about what the system consists of. It talks about the services that are provided, the benefits in a much clearer fashion. And so part of systems thinking is to be able to communicate the clarity in a simple way, and also to understand systems so you can work in them and improve them. Because if you have an understanding of your organization as a bubble diagram, how can you ever make sense out of it and improve it? So that's an example of how to use systems thinking to create clarity. So what about strategic planning? Let me share an example with you of a vision statement. You can read that for yourself. It's the vision statement for Career Mental Health Organization. So when I started working with them to develop the strategic plan, and I asked if they had a vision, said this is what we have, and something that they couldn't repeat. That wasn't used in the organization because it was just too complicated, it was unclear. And so during a recent strategic planning process, we just tossed that thing out and came up with a different one. And here's what we had that I feel really makes more sense and is more clear. And I love that because this is not only for a government agency, but for a mental health agency. We provide an exceptional experience for every person, every time. Now, this is something that you can communicate all the way down to an organization. You can look at any interaction with a consumer and say, is this really providing an exceptional experience for the person that you're dealing with every time? So all of a sudden, from this big paragraph, we went to just a line and a half. We're able to say, here's the direction we want to go. This is something that we want to achieve, and certainly we're not there yet, but people can rally around it. So you can see that strategic planning can help you create clarity in the organization. So before we start, I want to share just a little bit about myself, how I got into behavior analysis and systems thinking, strategic planning. So I grew up in Germany, and as you may have guessed by my accent, after I graduated with a bachelor's in architectural engineering, I had the opportunity to work for an architect's office in Texas. I worked there for a while, and after a few years I found out that the approach that they used for creating spaces was just too intuition-based and too haphazard. We designed a lot of schools, and classrooms took on interesting shapes that looked great on paper. The superintendents who signed the paychecks, they really liked it, but I talked to teachers afterwards, and they said it was really a bad space to work in. But they were kept being produced because it was something different. And because I enjoy working with people, I started looking at getting a master's degree in something to do with people, with counseling or so. But I didn't want to give up my architectural background. And so somebody shared with me a catalog from the University of North Texas. And in the description of one of the departments, they had the words human behavior and environment in the same sentence. I said, oh, that's great, because I didn't want to toss out what I had learned about architecture. And so I thought I could do that. And so I went into the program, the University of North Texas, and while I was going to school, I worked at what was then called the Denton Street School. It's a residential facility that's on the screen here, serving about 400 individuals. And I started out as a behavior therapist, implementing behavior plans, and then got into HR orientation and curriculum development. And for 4 weeks or 6 weeks or so, I was working on the floor as right care staff doing abuse investigation. So I really get an appreciation of the work that you do here every day. And you can see a little bit that this is not a residential setting like you have, it's much more institutionalized. So during that time, I discovered my passion for organizational systems, and here's how that happened. The Texas Association for Applied Behavior Analysis, TXABA, invited Dennis Reed to give a talk at one of our conferences. He was supposed to be the keynote speaker, but he couldn't make it. So instead, a guy named Rick Saunders gave a systems talk, and that really opened my eyes, because he was talking about how organizational systems typically just stifle, in many cases stifle behavior, stifle performance. He gave an example of a fire drill that worked really great, except one person didn't really know how to handle a fire extinguisher. So everybody had to go through fire training, everybody go through stuff that they already knew. And instead of just maybe pointing out to one person who couldn't do it, help them to work with that. And I was seeing that, especially when I was working on the floor as direct care staff, how the overall system was just not really being helpful. I remember one time a supervisor going through, I was working in the homeland with eight adults that were violent to some extent, so for a little while we had them all sitting still, doing some activity. Supervisor blows right through, the unit supervisor blows right through and just doesn't say anything. Then she says, get that dirt out of the corner, and she walked right out. I'm thinking, there's staff doing a great job, but she should tell us to get this thing out of the corner. So I really knew that I wanted to work with systems to create environments that not only produce results, but allow people to be effective and really enjoy their work. And so that's what I'm here talking about. So after I got my master's at UNT, and after a one-year stint at the University of Nevada in Reno, I went to, someone referred to that, Western Michigan University, and it's here on the screen, to work on my doctorate with Dale Breathauer. He's a systems guy in OBM, and a lot of what I talk about today, I learned from him. So while I was working at Western Michigan University, I had the opportunity to work as an intern for Kalamazoo County government. And my task, I was working with the county administrator and the county board, and my task was to set up a continuous quality improvement system. I had no idea what that was, but the county administrator was a great mentor, so I was able to work on that and then go from there and get into strategic planning. I'll tell you a little bit about that later. So you may wonder, why is this Peter showing slides of aerial photographs? Why do we talk about that? So I'm showing you these because if you're not familiar with those locations, they're pretty messy looking, right? They're kind of like a bubble diagram of some space on Earth. To find your way around campus, you need a map. And that's exactly what systems thinking and what strategic planning does. It helps you create a roadmap for an organization. It helps you analyze what is out there, and then in strategic planning, you have the opportunity to create a roadmap for the future. So taking something like this and making sense out of it and creating clarity. So here's my presentation roadmap for what I talked to you about today. We have 3 sections: organizational behavior management, give you an overview of what it is, just some highlights on the areas of application, and then spend a little more time on feedback and how to provide feedback. Systems thinking, we'll talk about behavioral systems analysis and the model that I want to introduce in total performance system. And then finally, strategic planning. What does the planning process look like? In a nutshell, I don't want to go into a lot of detail there. What are ingredients of a good strategic plan? And then what does implementation look like, and how can you support a successful implementation of the strategic plan in your organization, whether you work at Melmark or elsewhere? So if as a result of you putting into practice some of the things we talk about, then I think our time was well spent. So the first part is about OBM, Organizational Behavior Management. OBM has many things to offer for those who want to make sure their systems are set up so that they can support effective performance. You deal with that all the time. And so it's not only effective performance for individuals, but also effective performance for entire organizations. So let's define OBM. So this definition, to define that, I looked up the description in the 2018, so next year's our program book. That's not very clear, is it? I mean, we talk about clarity and then they have a definition like this. So here's a definition that helps me understand what OBM is. OBM helps people be more effective at what they do. And that's really what it is all about. That's really what systems thinking is all about, and strategic planning also. So let me give you a little bit of a history of OBM, where they came from. The work of Watson and Skinner influenced the field of OBM. Skinner's application of behavioral principles to instructional design served as a starting point for the use of behavioral principles and science of behavior in the workplace. And many original OBMers came out of the field. So there's Watson and Skinner. And one of the key people I have about a 3-second lag on the screen, so if I click too fast, I apologize for that. One of the key people in applying in OBM was applying behavioral principles to the workplace was Aubrey Daniels. You may have heard of him. I think you may use the book and some of the teaching that you do here. And he established one of the largest behavioral consulting firms starting out in the early 70s, and he introduced hundreds of business leaders to behavioral principles and to OBM. And when it was still in its infancy. The first teacher of OBM was Dick Malott, who was teaching behavior OBM courses at the University of Michigan. I had the privilege of having him on my dissertation committee as well, next to Bill Breathauer. Some early publications in OBM were not in behavioral journals. Early publications were in the Harvard Business Review, Personnel, Organizational Behavior, and Human Performance. You can see all that. The title in Harvard Business Review's article was Of Pigeons and Men. So very telling. So one of the early challenges of OBMers was to learn the language of business, because they were talking to non-behavior analysts, and so they had to try to avoid terms like punishment, negative reinforcement, modification of behavior. Those terms didn't go over very well. And so instead they started using terms that they still use today, or we still use today, as coaching, mentoring, discourage behavior, encourage behavior, and so on. So that doesn't mean we're selling out, but it just means that for people to work with what we have to offer, we have to speak the language. And I remember when I was going to Western, the conversation was always around how pure do you have to be to our terminology versus just watering it down for the general public. But at some point, you also got to look at what's practical, what makes sense for the people that we're working with. So by 1977, over 40 articles on OBM had been published in different journals. And then that year, 1977, the Journal of Organizational Behavior Management was instituted, was published, and the first editor was Aubrey Daniels, the business consultant who introduced many people to the field. He christened the article, the journal, and also with that he christened the field of OBM. Before that, there was not really a name for it. So he was the one that gave us the name. One of the early books written kind of like for organization, behavior management in organizations was written by Dick Malott. This cover shows one of the early publications from 1975. It's called Contingency Management in Education and Other Equally Exciting Places. And it looks like a comic book because it is a comic book. So it's great for somebody who likes pictures. Do we have another clicker or something? So that's one of the pages from the book. The main areas of OBM are performance management, behavioral systems analysis, and behavior-based safety. I just wanted to say something really quickly to that. First, performance management. Performance management is defined as managing individual employees or a group of employees through the application of behavioral principles. Performance management is the only scientific approach to improving performance that uses the concepts Does it lag? Okay. Thanks, Rita. So the goal of performance management is to identify what variables maintain undesired behavior and to change these variables in such a way that unproductive performance decreases and productive performance increases. That's not really any different from the work that you do with the individuals you serve, except this is applied to behavioral organizations. One of the first widely recognized OBM applications was in the late 1960s by a man named Ed Feeney. He was working for Emory Freight and was taking some behavior analytic course at the University of Michigan for business people that was designed by Dale Brethauer. And he designed a program, Instruction for Sales Training, that led to substantial improvements in sales. And he continued applying behavioral principles to Emory Air Freight and had some behavioral systems in place that produced a $2 million increase in annual profits using applied behavior analysis principles. That was really one of the first breakthroughs, and it was really widely published in the literature back then, so it's a great start. OBM interventions have achieved improvements in more than 100%, saving millions of dollars to organizations, many industries, manufacturing, engineering, sales, safety, distribution, transportation, government, any place really where people work. And some of the main applications really are leadership development, workplace motivation, injury reduction, quality improvement, incentive systems, and so on. Reinforcement feedback system, that's all a big part of what OBMers do. Next is behavioral systems analysis. It is defined as a set of concepts and techniques that help establish healthy school, workplace, and clinical environments. That principle, or this concept, derived from two fields. One was behavior analysis. Behavior analysis helps us understand how people function in environments. The other source for the field of behavioral system analysis was general systems concepts, which helps us understand how the world works, how systems work. And so we put this together. And if you put these two things together, we can do a much better job of understanding performance in systems, in environments, and help both the environments and the systems and the people perform better. So we'll talk about that in just a second here. So the value of behavioral systems analysis is that it allows us to analyze organizations outside the basic three-term contingency of antecedents, behavior, and consequence. So that's the contribution that DSA makes. So here are some examples of applying behavioral systems analysis to organizations, some of the results. Closing the feedback loop of a training program increased productivity and saved over $20 million in 1 year in just one company that improved the training. Linking the three levels of organization, process, and individual performers reduced customer complaints at a store by over 50%. And finally, and that's one of my favorites, the mortgage application process for a bank took 26 days. So systems people looked at what's happening to the mortgage application in the meantime, only to find out that it was sitting on somebody's desk most of the time. So they were able to cut out all the wasted time and reduced it to 15 minutes, and were able to do the mortgage application right there with the customer waiting. So you can, and in turn, the bank's business improved with respect to mortgages. So it's very impressive results. The final area of OBM I would like to look at is behavior-based safety. So that's certainly a guy that could use some intervention right there. So behavior-based safety focuses on the analysis and alteration of work environments to reduce injuries and promote safe behavior among leaders and employees. So again, it's across the entire organization. BBS is behavior-based because it focuses on intervening at the behavior level. to enforce behaviors that are safe and identify behaviors that are unsafe. And looking more at the consequence level than at the antecedent level, which typically is safety training and more safety training and more safety training and posters and slogans and signs, which is typically not very effective in organizations. So we have to look at the consequence piece of that as well. And BBS has shown great results in a lot of organizations, especially those where accident rates are typically high: mining, oil refineries, oil field drilling, fleet services, manufacturing plants, and so on. To be successful, BBS intervention has to start at the top with the CEO and be driven down to all the levels, supervisors and frontline employees. And in fact, a lot of these procedures, like what you do here at Melmar, a lot of procedures have to be put into standard operating procedures and to policies so that it is really becoming part of the organization. Because a lot of these interventions take years to come to fruition because it involves a lot of culture change in many cases. So here's some results from BBS. The leading oil and natural gas production company reduced total injuries by 54% in the course of 1 year. That's quite dramatic. A steel mill cut the lost time accident rate by 50% and achieved eventually 1 million man hours without a single lost time accident. So I looked at what does it mean, 1 million man hours? It means that if one of us would work 500 years, we would not have a single accident that would get us off our job in some of these dangerous industries. So that's quite impressive as well. In fact, the JOBM last week came out with a special issue on process safety, where process engineers from the petrochemical industry went to the Cambridge Center for Behavioral Studies to find out how they can learn more about human behavior so they can cut out the human variation in their safety systems. So I already mentioned that BBS is founded on positive and constructive feedback, so consequences rather than antecedents. And the neat thing is that they also employ co-workers and observing other co-workers to encourage those kind of behaviors. So in summary, all these OBM interventions from performance management, behavioral system analysis, and also from behavior-based safety show that there's a lot of contributions that OBM can make to workplaces and to the safety. One thing I want to share with you is just a comparison of research in the two different fields of OBM and applied behavior analysis. So what we have here is a table that was published in 2005 in OBM. And it compares 5 years of research. Left side is JOBM, so OBM research, and the right side is applied behavior analysis research. And as you can see, the OBM side is very heavy on consequences. So we have 75% of all research topics, or the IVs, had to do with feedback or praise. And in the Java and the applied setting, praise and feedback are also being talked about, but it's only 1/4. There's more work looking at the antecedent piece. So we know from experience that it's critical to provide the right consequences to people we work with, but it's also true for direct reports and that we work with to make sure that their behavior is as effective as it can be. And part of that is to make sure that we cut out extraneous stimuli out of feedback, that the feedback is very focused. That's exactly what you do when you teach in the classrooms. You just make sure that the reinforcement you provide is really right for the behavior. You take away extraneous stimuli. And the goal is to provide clarity so that people know what's expected from them. So however, even though there's a big research topic, a lot of managers and supervisors in many organizations struggle with providing the corrective feedback. Before we turn to systems thinking, I want to share with you two ineffective feedback methods that probably many of us use. I know I've used those in the past, and describe what to do instead. They came from a book that was written by Olga Daniels, Oops, the name of the book, Oops, 30 Management Practices That Waste Time and Money and What to Do Instead. It's a great book, by the way. If you don't have it in the OBM library, I encourage you to get that. So the first feedback problem is you did a good job, but. You've heard that before. And this guy says, this is really an innovative approach But I'm afraid we can't consider it. It's never been done before. So typically in the yes, but, the intent is to be helpful, to help people do their best. However, often the impact is offensive. If you want to improve my performance or tell me what I can do, but just tell me. Don't just package it. And it's really not effective in changing behavior. It's also true for the second incorrect way of providing feedback. It's called the feedback sandwich. So we all have experienced that. Packaging critical feedback, constructive feedback, between layers of praise and ending with praise, thinking that it would be more effective in changing behaviors, which it is not. Really what it does, it dilutes the corrective feedback because we're adding all these extraneous stimuli of what we consider niceties. It may make the manager feel good, but certainly doesn't do much to change the behavior. So these two feedback practices, yes but and the feedback sandwich, don't provide clarity to the employee at all. So what can we do instead? So here's just a few things. The first one is feedback done right to monitor performance. Behavioral researcher Judy Komaki conducted studies with 24 supervisors. 12 of those supervisors were considered top well-performing supervisors, and the other 12 were considered not so good or marginal supervisors. And the result of the study looked at what do they spend their time on with respect to feedback. So the study found out that there was not really a big difference with respect to time spent on antecedents and consequences. So they were very similar. So what then was the difference between the great supervisors and the marginal supervisors? Well, the difference was that the effective supervisors spent 60% more time observing the behavior of the direct reports, which makes a lot of sense. Unless you observe somebody's behavior, how can you provide constructive and effective feedback? So, and the monitoring of behavior can be done all the way from the top to down the corporate ladder with respect to, for example, frequency. In the direct care staff, you may observe daily, you provide feedback right there on the behavior. For a manager or director, you may look at the accomplishments of behavior. So is the report turned in on time? How's the evaluation? And so on. So you look at the results of behavior and reinforce that, but maybe on a weekly level. But either way, it can be done by monitoring the performance. It's really critical. So the second component is to provide positive reinforcement and only positive reinforcement. The first part is to make it personal, contingent, immediate, and frequent. So these are the same principles that you have applied for your work here at Melmark. Probably some of the points that I'm talking about, or will talk about, with respect to providing feedback to direct reports, you already use in your work here when you teach the children and adults. Then reinforce small improvements. We know that as shaping. Managers often set stretch goals before they want to reinforce anybody. The problem with stretch goals is that they're so far stretched that it's very difficult to come up to the point where behavior can be reinforced or behavior that accomplishes a task. So what happens is people don't achieve the behavior, don't get close, and supervisor managers say, well, they don't deserve any praise because they haven't gotten there. So what to do instead is just to chop down even ambitious goals into smaller steps that can be accomplished so that you can reinforce the behavior as the approximation to what you want to see. So incremental goals go much longer ways than having one stretch goal, even though that's one of the things that are popular with a lot of managers and executives. Then separate the good from the bad, even if it's just by a few minutes. So for example, you may see somebody do something that they do really well, with some areas for improvement. So you just say, what you just did here is really great, turn around and walk away, and maybe after a few steps, come back and say, oh, by the way, if you would do this differently next time, that might be more effective. So even though there's a short separation between the reinforcement and the constructive feedback, separates it and also is perceived as more helpful. Or you can talk to somebody, go back to your office, and then pick up the phone and say, by the way, next time you have a report like this, why don't you try something like this? Again, that's perceived as more helpful, and because the message is clear. Here's what you do really well, and here's correct and improve. And then the other rule is use 4-to-1 ratio. Use the 4-to-1 ratio as a guide. Studies have shown that teachers in classrooms who have a 4-to-1 ratio of positive reinforcement to negative had much better discipline and better achievements in their classrooms. They also took the study to families, and delinquent families had a ratio of 1-to-1. So for any good thing that the parents said, there was also a negative one. Families that were non-delinquent families also had a 4-to-1 ratio of positive comments to negative comments. So for managers or for you working here, the 4-to-1 ratio really is more a ratio for yourself. It's not just, have I reinforced this person 4 times over 1 time, maybe constructive feedback. It's about, at the end of the day, you think about, was I overall more positive in my interaction with people, or was I overall more negative? Because the point that Orbit Daniels makes is that in most organizations, a lot of good things happen. We just have to recognize those. So the ballpark here is, are we more positive overall? And so what you might find is that there's room for improvement. Because anybody who has kids knows it's just easy to jump on something that's negative. And I find myself at home, I have 2 teenage boys, 16 and 18, and they have to make a point out the good thing instead of jumping all over whatever else that they're doing. People who don't have time to provide oral feedback, or maybe it's something that you don't want to interfere right now because there's something going on, you can also use a thumbs up. So finally, and we talked about that briefly, is to provide the corrective feedback separately. One way, and studies show that the best way to provide constructive feedback is immediately before the next response, next performance, or sometime after the not so good performance. That's really critical. And what you want to do is state the problem behavior and the behavior take its place. Too many people, and you know that from applied behavior analysis, from the work you do, just saying don't do this is not enough. So what do we have to do instead, right? And that has to be clearly stated by the supervisor. And then also state the consequences if that behavior persists. So you may say, for example, other people have to do your work, or you have to stay longer, or in the long term, I have to write you up. So we have to be really clear. So if you provide the yes but feedback, or if you provide the feedback sandwich, that typically doesn't get addressed. But if the goal is to provide clarity to improve individual performance, that's one way to do that. It's not all that difficult. And then end your constructive feedback by asking questions. Offer help, see if you can provide any clarity as well, and then thank for the conversation, and go from there. And the reason I talk about feedback is because, as I showed you earlier, it's the most investigated independent variable in the JOBM. So there must be a reason for that, right? Because managers typically don't get taught this kind of feedback. They get taught the yes but, and they get taught the other ones because supposedly it improves performance, but that's not necessarily a data-based assumption. So just in summary, to wrap up the OBM section. OBM applies behavioral principles to individual performance. It applies behavioral systems principles to improve organizational performance and of the work that people do internally. It applies to all settings and work environments. It applies to schools, it applies to human services settings, government institutions, anywhere. And then finally, what I'd like to encourage you to do is review the JOBM, the Journal of Organizational Behavior Management, for intervention in human service settings. There are quite a few there. Actually, sometimes people complain because there's too many human service settings application, not in other industries necessarily. So that concludes the OBM part. And going back to our roadmap, next we go to systems thinking. And when I talk about systems thinking, I talk about the application of behavioral systems analysis to organizations. And the particular systems model that I want to introduce to you is called the Total Performance System. Let me start out with an example from the Main Street Business Press that talks about how organizational systems, if we don't take care of them, can really create havoc with other interventions. So there's an article, that was an article in the Harvard Business Review last year. It talked about why leadership training fails and what to do about it. So when I read the article, I was reminded of what Rick Saunders taught 25 years earlier at the Tex Alba conference about systems. So here are some quotes from the article. So they say there were unclear directions on strategy and value. The system had to shape people instead of people shaping the system. Again, we're talking about clarity in organizations. Finally, they said leadership training didn't work because the senior team had not articulated the clear strategy and corporate values. And when we go to strategic planning, we talk about how important it is to communicate that. So if you have all these non-clarity issues in the organization and you try to train people to do better, it's not going to really work well. There was actually a quote that Gary Rumler said, I mentioned his name earlier, who did some early behavior training at the University of Michigan for business people. And he said that if you pit a good performer against the bad system always wins. And that is so true. And you see that in organizations where there's high turnover. People leave because the systems are not supporting effective performance. So before I move on, I want to share with you another article, also from Harvard Business Review that came out this summer. I shared it with a few of you. It's really interesting because it's an excellent piece in talking about how adults with autism are now sought after by larger corporations to do some work that more normal people, so to speak, can do really well. And it's called Neurodiversity as Competitive Advantage, because individuals with autism or the autism spectrum disorder, they have some skills where they totally outperform the typical worker. So if you're interested, I'll be happy to share an electronic copy with you. I find it's a great article, and it was great for me to see that the major business press is picking this kind of work here. So going to systems thinking, let's talk about what is a system. So a system is defined as a set of elements standing in relation among themselves and with the environment. That's not very clear either, right? It's kind of like the OBM definition. So really what that means is, in order to understand a system, we must know the parts and how they connect. So let me give you some examples of what a system is, or systems are. We're talking about here examples of living systems as opposed to IT systems or structural systems. So the smallest systems are cells. They are living systems. They fit our definition of system because they consist of elements that stand in interrelation among each other and themselves. So there's the stuff that's going on inside the cell wall, but the cell is also interacting with its environment. That makes it a system. Out of that system come organs, and out of organs come organisms. And then the next higher level system is groups, so it's a group of organisms and organizations, and then also nations and supernatural systems. So even those are all different size systems. They all can be analyzed with using the total performance system that I'm going to share with you. The three bold words, organism, groups, and organizations, those are the systems that OBM is concerned about. So now, systems thinking. Is that a new concept or is that an old concept? You've probably heard this before, right? The whole is more than the sum of its parts. It's describing a system. Any idea who said that? Any idea who said that? That was first said by Aristotle, who lived 2,400 years ago. And the definition is still valid today. So we can safely say that behavioral system or systems thinking is not a new discipline. Systems thinking and system change is typically messier than it might appear from glowing case studies in popular press. So Dale Brethower said that, and this is really true. Because if you think it's messy to change the performance of an individual, now try to change the performance of an entire organization. They can get really messy, and you saw the bubble diagram that I showed you at the beginning, people trying to figure that out. So how do you recognize a system that is bad? Well, a bad system has low morale, has high turnover, underperformance, bad customer service. Many of these cases, people know how to perform, just the system that's stifling the performance. So what we want to do using systems tools is to create clarity about the systems and help organizations improve. So the tool that I mentioned earlier is the Total Performance System, which was developed by Dale Breathauer in the late 1960s, early 1970s. And so I'm going to introduce the system to you one piece at a time. The first piece in the performance system is the inputs. Any organizational system, whether it's large or small, whether it consists of 1 people or 1,000 or 10,000 people, requires inputs to perform. So when you think of a company that builds cars, you have to have raw material, you have to have people, facilities, customer, money, information. All these things make up inputs. Those inputs are then go into the processing system where value is added to these inputs. So you take a raw material like a piece of sheet metal, gets stamped into a fender, and then eventually a car is put together out of that. The processing system for Melmar consists of HR, IT, finance, things you do behind the scenes, writing programs, facilities planning, all that is part of your processing system. And as the result, you create a service or product. So that's called an output. You're more service heavy, other organizations, they're more product heavy. So, and then the product is relieved by what we call the receiving system. The receiving system is not only consisting of customers that we typically think of, also beneficiaries. Customers are typically people that might receive the service immediately or directly, while beneficiaries are other people or other groups that can benefit from that. Let me give you an example. Let's say hip replacement. You know, people typically are older who get a new hip, even though they might be the customer, but because of the problems they had in the past or they had before when they had their bum hip, they could not be as active maybe with their family, or if they're older, they have grandchildren, they can't do certain things because of the limitations. Maybe they want to volunteer and have to kind of scale back on the volunteering because they either are in pain or don't have the energy, whatever. Sometimes people who are at the workplace, they can't perform because they don't have the help that they need. So now they get the new hip, right? They are the customer, but at the same time, all the other places, the family members, the volunteer organizations, the employer, they all benefit. So the work that you do, you may help an individual directly, but you never know how that individual later on in life will impact others because of the work that you did. So that's why we call take a bite out of the receiving system, because we can never really fully define who benefits from the work that you do. I got a tour of Melmar today. Jan gave me a great tour, and we can document all the processes, and we can get a pretty good idea of what it looks like inside the processing system. But you'll never be able to really track down and trace the people that move away from here, how they impact their lives. Some of the adults that you may work with, or the children that graduate, become adults, and they get great jobs, make a big difference in the world that you don't know now that that's happening. Typically, when people talk about an organizational system, they end right here. They say we have something that gets produced and somebody's buying it or using it. However, we're talking about a good performance system. So total performance system is total because there are other elements that are needed. The first one is that a total performance system has to be guided. And the guidance typically consists of mission, vision, and goals. So that's what gets generated through strategic planning. And the key question that you have to answer for folks in an organization is, who are we? Where are we going? How do we get there? And how do we know we have arrived? And you just went through some strategic planning, you're doing great rollout here. And those are the questions that are being answered by your strategic plan. At the same time, a healthy system also has to be adaptive to the environment. So there have to be feedback loops. The first feedback loop is what we call the process feedback. That gives you information about how you are doing internally. If you manufacture something, the question is, how much does it cost to produce a widget? How does it take to produce one? In an HR environment, you may say, how long does it take for us to fill a leadership position? How much does it cost? How much does it cost to develop a curriculum? And so on. Those are all internal metrics that then become input again. So if you look at the arrow, it points right back at the beginning of the box there, right under input. So you have to have the data to be able to react to it. A lot of organizations collect a lot of data, but they don't do anything with it, so it doesn't become input, and therefore the system is not adaptive. They keep doing what they have been doing because they've been doing it for 20 years. And then the final feedback loop is what we call outcome feedback. So outcome feedback talks about how customers are using the products or services that are provided by an organization. Sometimes that outcome feedback may take the form of customer surveys or customer focus groups. So this is the only 7 elements that really you need to answer all the questions about a system. And Dale Breathauer published this in 1972 and introduced the total performance system to the bigger world. Here's the cover of his book. The book is called Behavioral Analysis in Business and Industry, a Total Performance System. And you can easily see that he worked closely together with Dick Mollot, because it also is a comic book. There's a page from that book. So now, why are there only 7 elements in the total performance system? Why not 10? Why not 12? Organizations are complex. Why not 15? Well, the reason is that, as the psychologist George Miller pointed out in a paper written in 1956, the title of the paper was The Magic Number 7 ± 2. And he was postulating that for humans it's easier to keep 7 things in mind at the same time, 7 ± 2. So we're talking about the mind, but things that we can deal with, pieces of information that we can handle at the same time. So if you think about somebody who is important to you, gives you a phone number, you can probably remember that without, let's say, the area code. You can remember that. You can remember a zip code. But when it comes to driver's licenses or social security numbers, it's becoming more difficult. And that's simple information. So if you try to break down an organizational system into 15 or 20 different pieces, you may be getting more fine-grained information, but it would be very difficult to keep all those in mind and react to that. And so using the smallest amount of information that you need to make a system into a performance system is what Dale Breathauer also researched when he applied the system in the early 70s. At the time he was running Education Center, the Reading Center at the University of Michigan. And he applied the systems model there, and not only did the management improve, but also the outcomes for the learners improved in the learning center. So that was the earliest application of the system model. And as we go through it, you will see that 7 elements are really allow you to work at all levels of the organization. And then systems thinking is about asking questions, asking the right questions. Because if you ask the question about those 7 different elements, you'd be amazed how much information you can glean from an organization if you ask people about it. So for example, if I work with an organization, one of the questions I ask is, what is the purpose of the organization? Do you have a mission statement? Do people know where you're going? How do you know that you're successful? And so on. Do your people know what your mission and vision are? And it's just amazing how many times people say, I don't think so, I don't know, no they don't. Leadership doesn't know that. I work with nonprofits as well, and you would think that the leaders and the board of directors that would know the mission statement of the organization they're serving. No, it's totally amazing. It's just such a great opportunity to really drive clarity through an organization which is not being used. So how do we know that we are successful with our services? How do you know that your services make a difference in the life of individuals? You track data. You're a very data-intensive organization. Businesses are not that way. Universities are not that way, for example. They report what's required by the state, and that's where it stops. And that doesn't even mean that that information is helpful to run an effective organization. So by starting out with just asking questions, you will be able to get clarity on the system that you're looking at, and also find out what are areas within the system that we need to improve. What I want to share with you is just an example of how we use systems thinking by asking questions. This is just an org chart of one of the PIHPs that I was working with. It's the provider for, it's a PIHP for 8 Michigan counties, so it's working with 8 CMHs. And the reason I show that to you is typically in org charts or in those kind of structural diagrams, you just see lines. I don't know whether you can read that or not, but between the lines are little words that clarify what the relation is, what relationship is between those different elements. So this says directs, or it says advise, or provides input, or provides information. And I've done other org charts like that because typically people look at it and say, well, so there's a line, but what does it mean? And especially if you have an organization like this where you have 8 independent agencies, they have an overall organization that's telling them how to do things, provides the money, then you have all these committees at the bottom. People were not clear what their role is and how all this fits together. So just providing some clarity was helpful, and the only way you do that is to ask questions. So who's in the system and who does what? Let me ask you a question. So if we have 7 elements in a system, what do you think is the most important one? So any ideas? We have 7 elements. Process feedback is really, really critical. Without it, you couldn't improve. Feedback? Outcome. Also, with outcomes, you wouldn't have customers. But really, for a systems thinker, all elements are equally important. Because if you take one of those away, the feedback loop or the outcomes or so, the system will fall apart. It cannot operate. So if any one of the system elements is not linked to all the other elements, the entire system cannot perform optimally. And I lost my slides there, so I'm going to look at it this way. So I talked about the word optimally. It's on the screen here, the last word. Many organizations, when they talk about making something better, they say we got to maximize performance. And the word maximizes is everywhere. And for a systems thinker, it's a big bad word. Let me give you an example. Salespeople who want to maximize their performance, they need to sell whatever widget you're building. However, if production cannot keep up with the number of widgets that people order, then they will fall behind and you cannot satisfy your customers. So that's a big problem. So maximizing one part of the system always means that you're not maximizing, optimizing something else. So we don't want to use the word maximize. Instead, the word that we want to use as systems thinkers is optimize. So if we optimize performance, that means we look at all elements of a system equally. So in the example of the sales organization, what that means is that salespeople only sell what can be produced without overpromising. At the same time, the production folks, knowing that there's increasing demand out there, need to do what they can do to ramp up performance and production so that eventually the need can be met. But if you overproduce, or if even the production people, they maximize production, they overproduce, stuff is sitting in inventory, that's cash on the floor that's not being used. So when you think of a system, think of how can we optimize it? How can we make sure that all elements of the system work really well together? We talk, similar example is when we talk about work-life balance. But if you overemphasize and maximize one, then the other one is hurting. Whether it's, that. So because systems are living systems, this optimization is always a balancing act. It's always an equilibrium. You have to work on making sure that pieces are aligned in balance. So let me show you another great advantage of the systems model, the total performance system. It is scalable. What I mean by that is that it can apply to the overall organization. It can apply to processes like departments and functions. It also can apply to individual performers. So we don't have to learn new terms, we don't have to learn new diagrams, we don't have to learn anything new about it, because at any of these levels, the system model applies. We still have to have direction. The department has to have a purpose. Department head process have to have feedback loops, and even individual performers. You have to know how well you're doing. The input may consist of expectations, your role, knowing who your customer are. So, looking at it, the systems model works from big to small, organizations to process to performer, and also, if you want to design really good job descriptions, what you want to do is you want to look at what system is that person working on, what processes does the person have to support, and make sure that the task in the job really allow the support of that particular function or department. And then look at the department. If that is well organized, you look at what is the role of the department within the large organization. Are the purposes of the department aligned with the purposes of the organization? Sometimes that's not happening. I was working with another organization where people wouldn't get frequent budget updates. So they would get numbers from 2 months ago on how they performed, how the department was performing. And there was no transparency of how the money was being used. And the CFO was somebody who was old school in a negative way, very controlling. So people could not really perform in the department well because they didn't know how much money was in the budget, how much money was left over. I mean, totally unthinkable, but that's what's out there. So if you think this whole performance system model might be difficult to implement and to apply in your work, whatever it is that you're doing, it's not. Let me give you just an example of what a systems diagram can look like if you do it for organization. This is what I did was when I was working at Kalamazoo County Government during my internship there and later on my work there. So I used that model to help the department. It was the clerk register. The clerk is the department that where you get the birth certificates and so on. And the register is the department where they record all real estate transactions, whether it's a sale of a house or refinancing or so. So I just can't go in and tell them how to do the work. So the first thing I did was ask questions using the systems model as a guide, and then I was able to reflect that back to the department head by just showing this kind of diagram. And if you look at it per box, there's only a few words in there that kind of highlight the function. So it doesn't have to be a super complicated description, just the highlights, because if you put more in, people just don't understand it. So you see we have the inputs, processes, outputs, we have what we call stakeholders, we have process indicators, outcome indicators, and so on. Everything is in place. So for an OBMer, kind of creating this kind of system, whether it's formally for a client, or if you just do it informally, putting that on paper and maybe sharing it with someone who says, am I getting this right? Whether it's for a department or even sometimes for a project team, you can do this as well. Say, are we on the same page with this? Well, I thought we were doing this. Now, this is what we have to do. And even getting clarity on the customer can be also critical. I was working with a nonprofit. And I didn't do the systems model, but there was no clarity on who the customer was. I was doing strategic planning with the board, and when we talked about creating a mission for the organization, the question would come up, who are we serving? The name of the organization was Advocacy Services for Kids, right? So kids is in the title. So several board members, half the board say, well, we're serving kids. When in fact, they did not do anything for kids. They were helping parents to become advocates for their children. So now can you imagine going into an organization and you want to do strategic planning and one half says we're serving kids, the other half says we're serving the parents. So the first thing there you have to do is create clarity. And the reason I'm sharing that example is because often we just presume that people who work in an organization all are on the same page with respect to who we are, where we're going, who we serve, and so on. And that may not be clear at all. So just taking a systems view can be really critical, and asking simple questions. So the problem that they had with this department here was that they had an extreme backlog in the registry department. They were not being able to keep up, and when the register came in and asked for more staff from the county board of commissioners, they turned them down because they were thinking staff were lazy Even though they had a lot of overtime, they're saying, well, they're just getting overtime because they want to get more money. However, one of the things that we looked at, and now remember, as BA analysts, we collect data, we love data, we look at data, and it helps us with decision making and finding out what the problems are. They were not that sophisticated. Most organizations are not. And so we looked at what changed over time. So when a register department gets, they call it documents, whatever they get, the page numbers per document increased over half in just a short period of time. So there's a workload increase of 50%. They didn't know that. That was an eye-opener for people. They never really tracked it. Then we put this together with the staffing changes. And one of the things that you can see here is that the bottom line is the staffing changed over time. They were very, very straightforward there. 15% increase of staff in 5 years or 6 years. At the same time, the documents increased and the overall workload increased by 100%, so doubled in the same amount of time, with the staff increased 15%. So we were able to use the data and present it to the County Board of Commissioners, and now they had no more argument, so they had to provide more staff. And that was just an example. I'm not an expert in registered offices. I don't know what they do. So we have to go in and ask questions. The same is true for people who work in organizations doing OBM, whether internal OBM consultants or external OBM consultants. And you consider yourself also a consultant internally, because by asking questions, you can help improve systems. By just asking, do we have this? Why are things going this way? And how do we know that we're making a difference? Well, you're pretty data heavy, but a lot of organizations are not. And so the beauty of this systems approach, as I mentioned earlier, is that you can apply the same questions also to individuals. So it's actually called the human performance systems, right there. It has the same elements in place than the total performance system. The questions are very similar. We're talking about the feedback. Do we have clear and do we have the need to perform? Do we know when to perform? Do we know how to perform? Does the person receive the right feedback at the right time? What is the measures of performance? Are there incentives for the person? Does the person get feedback? And so on. And so it's kind of like the same questions. So looking at a human performance system is only also just a few elements. So this kind of system was initially created asking questions about the workplace. And an OBM professor at Western Michigan University, John Austin, I don't know whether you've met him there, Sean, or not, he used behavioral systems analysis to develop a simple performance diagnostic checklist, which was just asking simple questions of people in a work environment about performance deficiencies. Jim Carr and then David Wilder, they took this and they created the performance diagnostic checklist for human services, the PCDHS. I don't know whether you've seen that. Some of you may be familiar with it. It's really a great tool. It just on 2 pages with just 20 questions asking about performance in 4 areas: training, task clarification and prompting, resources, materials and processes, and performance and consequences. And I love that tool because it takes something that could be complex and overwhelming. How do we help improve somebody's performance into just 2 questions here? So we have the 2 pages there. And the beauty of it too is that this checklist also includes recommendations for interventions. So there's 2 pages with sample interventions. So when you ask a question about performance, every time you make a no, whether something is supporting performance or not, anytime you mark a no, there's a number on the left side, and you look at all the no's you have and look at the numbers that are corresponding, and based on those numbers, you can just pick an intervention, and that's the sheet right there. And these 4 interventions are all evidence-based, and they address very clearly the 4 different performance areas. Here's the last page. So it's really a beautiful tool that somebody developed by taking a systems view at a human performer. Say, what does a person have to have in place? The traditional way of changing performance is really more training, and it's not always training that's the problem. So before we wrap up the systems thinking part, I'd like to have you do an activity. Everybody should have a worksheet in front of you that's just a one-page worksheet. I'm going to go forward a little bit. It looks like this. Like that, right here. And what it does, it addresses the individual performer as a system. I used that checklist or a similar checklist. Dave Breathout was giving that in one of his courses. And when I was working for the county, starting an internship, and I was asked to work with a continuous quality improvement team, the county administrator suggested, why don't you just meet with the different department heads who are part of the team to learn about what they're doing and what their role is in the county. And I was thinking, I don't know what questions to ask, so I took this behavioral interview checklist and asked questions about what professional or personal goals do you achieve in your work? What do you do to perform your job or role? What are your major products or accomplishments or results? So these are all questions along the lines of the total performance system. And so they're on your, you cannot read them on the screen, but they're on your sheet on the screen. It looks like this. So I use those questions to meet with those individuals one-on-one, and the county administrator came back to me a while later and said, hey, Peter, these interviews went really well. I got good feedback from some people that said that they've never been asked those kind of questions. Some of them said that they never really thought about some of the things they asked, because one of the questions was, how do you know that your customers benefit from the work that you do? It's just an assumption, right? And so I'll just give you another story. There are two departments at the county. One is called the finance department, that's typical finance accounting arm of the county, and then it's also called the treasurer's office, people who collect the taxes and so on. And the finance department had to provide monthly reports to the treasurer. So they would print out the reports and take them to the treasurer monthly. And everything seemed to be okay. And until two people from these two offices had lunch together, and then the finance guy said, so how can you use our reports? They said, well, thanks for doing the reports, but we have to re-enter all the data because the way you produce it is not helpful for us. So that's another example of how we just presume that what we do works because nobody tells us about that it's not working. That's why it's so critical in a healthy system to ask for feedback from the people that you serve. So what I want you to do is go to your worksheet and turn around to a neighbor or find somebody by yourself, maybe somebody who's close by, and answer those 4 questions. Put your name on the worksheet, swap the worksheets, answer the 4 questions that are highlighted, the first, third, fifth, and seventh. And then swap the worksheet and ask the questions again. And then I would like for you to complete that within the next few days to kind of help you analyze yourself as a performance system. If you don't have a neighbor to talk to, maybe you can fill it on your own. But just go ahead and ask somebody, share those with somebody else, and kind of like interview the other person. And then you swap and interview the role, swap interview roles. Let's take a few minutes. So remember to jot down the answers on the other person's worksheet. when you're done asking questions from the other person, then just go up and the other person asks the question, 4 questions. So when you're done with the interview, make sure you end up with a sheet that has your name on it. It looks like most books are done, and I do encourage you to take that back to your workplace and complete it and go through it honestly and say, okay, am I really doing well in all these different areas right here? Or maybe there's something you can identify where you can maybe do things differently and become more effective in what it is that you're doing. So let's wrap it up and then try to complete it tomorrow. Before we move to strategic planning, I want to just real briefly summarize what we talked about with respect to systems thinking. So one of the takeaways is that organizations behave as systems regardless of whether they are managed as a system. Remember that, that's really critical. Just like kids, you know, they learn something. Whether they learn something that you want them to learn or not, they learn something, right? So the same with systems, they behave, but what you want to do is you want to make sure that the systems behave in a way that allows you to be providing the services and the outcomes that it is that you need to provide. Managers and supervisors who manage their organizations and classrooms as performance systems are more effective leaders, because not only are you aware of what's going on, but you also are aware of what has to be in place. So you can look at your feedback loops, you can ask for the right feedback. And if something is not in place, you got to make sure it's going to be put in there, because it's all critical. For the people that work for you know exactly what the job is all about, how they contribute to the overall organization. Those are questions you need to ask. So asking the right questions really improves effective leadership, decision making, also teamwork. You'd be amazed how many people you have on a team that if you ask them what the team is all about and what you're supposed to be accomplishing in your team meetings, that you get a wide range of answers, because people make it up if they don't know. And they say, well, I'm on the team because I have to, right? So to become a more effective system, you got to make sure that there's clarity throughout every level of the organization. And that's what systems thinking does. It provides clarity at all levels, which is really what we want to talk about today, is how can we create this clarity using systems thinking, and then also creating clarity with strategic planning, which is the next part of my conversation. So what we want to look at is the planning process, the strategic plan elements, and also the implementation. So I'm not thinking that any of you want to become a strategic planning facilitator. Some of you may have or will in the future participate in strategic planning sessions. So this conversation is not really so much about how to do strategic planning, rather than more about what's the product of strategic planning and how can we use it, how can we support it, how can we help implement those things. I've worked with over 70 organizations to help them develop strategic plans. There are some behavioral analytic organizations there. I work with the BACB, the Association for Professional Behavioral Analysts, APBA, Melmark, CalABA, and some other autism treatment centers. And it's been great work. Also do work with state universities and nonprofits, for-profits, family businesses. And the nice thing about this work really is that not only it's a lot of fun to help people create, communicate clarity, but also I get to learn about all these organizations because the process is very similar. What happens is the content. So the same with the systems model. It doesn't really matter what organization you're looking at, taking this total performance system with the 7 elements. You can go to any organization to ask those 7 questions and help people become smarter in the organization. So the same is true for strategic planning. If you get the right process, it doesn't have to be customized for an organization. When we worked here at Melmark, we did it for Melmark overall, we did it for the 2 states, and you can also use the same process to do planning for a department or for a function. That's what I'm doing with bigger companies, where I'm not going into corporate planning, but more working with the different functions that they have. So my focus is today to help you be a good consumer of strategic planning and the strategic plans. So, first of all, I wanted to put this slide out that says strategic planning matters. Now, this is a USA snapshot from 2004, and they asked US executives, what management issue do you consistently spend the most time on? And 39% that they spend the most time on strategic thinking and strategic planning. That's an awful lot of time. And the changes that you are experiencing right now in the human services environment, the state, federal changes, I mean, it's constantly you have to think big picture stuff. You have to think strategically, where are we going to be in 3 to 5 years? How is this decision and this legislation and this requirement affecting us? So you have to be nimble in addressing these things, and nothing is better than sitting down and develop a plan of how you want to address it, even if there's some uncertainty. So strategic planning is so important for organizations, for executives. Let's just take a look at what OBM research has to say about that. So for those of you who like data, let me give you some numbers here. Zero, nothing. An online search of all GOBM articles published since 1977 showed 0 article on strategic planning, even though it's important to organizations. There are studies that talk about strategy, some in the title, or strategic applications of something, but never strategic planning. So why do we think that is? Here's my educated guesses. It's difficult to collect data on effectiveness. It's true for a lot of systems intervention, because if you tweak one element in the system and you get some outputs, how do you know that that one tweak was it and not something else? How much improvement would we do in an environment due to strategic planning? I've seen organizations that implement or try to implement strategic plans that didn't really go well. You know, so is it plan at fault, or how does it look? The second reason could be that behavior analysts are typically not asked to do strategic planning. I don't know of any OBMer who does strategic planning. And then thirdly, behavior analysts are not trained in doing strategic planning. It's just not part of any graduate program how to do that and work at the systems level, though it's a systems tool. I got into strategic planning almost by accident when I was doing my internship at the county when I was getting my doctorate in Kalamazoo, Western Michigan University. I helped co-author the strategic planning manual for the organization and then started implementing it, working with different departments, elected officials on creating strategic plans. And I've used the same model since. I've been improving it, making it more effective, more efficient for the clients, and so on. So how do we know strategic planning works? This is what JOBM tells us, not much. There's a lot of books written about the effectiveness of strategic planning, how to do strategic planning. So here's some examples of just my own field research. There's some qualitative and anecdotal difference, evidence. So people tell me the plan helps solidify our vision and mission. We move from a nebulous plan to clear goals and strategies. People say, our plan is not sitting on the shelf, which is the fear for a lot of people, that they go through strategic planning process only to end up 6 months, 9 months later after a lot of work and putting the stuff on the shelf so never seen again. People have said, our whole team is now on the same page. Remember we talked about that earlier. It's so important that people in an organization really are all in agreement of where the organization is going, how to get there, and so on. One university said, our plan was a valuable asset in completing Moody's Investor Service credit rating for a university. Others say our strategic plan received a CARB exemplary status because it was really a nice plan that they put together. And finally, our strategic plan guides all aspects of our work. So that's what people tell me. So it's kind of qualitative feedback on, yes, strategic planning works for them. And there's also some numbers. Typically, I just don't go out and ask people, so 2, 3, 4 years later, so tell me exactly specifically how your performance improved because they have a strategic plan. But sometimes when I go back and I do an update or refresh a few years later, some organizations create an accomplishment report and say, here's what we have accomplished. So there's some numbers from that. Community employment referral for consumers increased over 1,000% in 3 years. That was for a human service organization. They won a competitive bid to place 2 individuals in a college cleaning contract. One municipality I worked with in Michigan was recognized as a township of excellence. And they said it's because we did what we said we would do in our strategic plan. One organization said the endowment increased over $2 million because one of the strategic goals had to do with increasing a more diversified funding stream and going after donors in a different way. One organization received an award for their work that they're doing with NPOs and said because doing our strategic planning process, we identified how we can help them differently and better, and as a result, it was recognized. So I would love to get more longitudinal data and just ask clients to do that. Maybe that's one way to do that. Maybe we can work together here at Melmont and you just keep me posted on how things are changing as a result of the strategic plan. That you may do other things already, but the strategic plan may have had clear impact here or there. And I want to close this evidence piece with a quote from one of my favorite behavior analysts. So he said, I had my doubts about the utility of the strategic planning process when our board first raised the issue. However, after going through the planning process with you, I'm confident that the plan you helped us create will be very useful for the organization and the discipline. So that was from Dr. Jim Cow, who is now the CEO of the BACB. And he was the first person in the behavior analytics field that I worked with. And he gave a lot of referrals. So that's another way I look at it as a sole proprietor, as somebody who has a small consulting firm. How do I get my contracts, right? And so word of mouth, people say, this plan worked for us, so you got to work with Peter and create your strategic plan. So that's another measure of outcome that I use. It's more informal. But there are not a lot of other data research done by GOBM or OBMers. That's maybe one area where we can improve the field, because I think it's a great way to work at the system level. Because without a strategic plan, without a strategic direction, you can make improvements, but what if you make improvements that work well, but don't help the organizations move in the direction that they need to? It's always great to be efficient, but you want to be efficient at doing the right things and not being efficient at doing the wrong things. So let's talk about what strategic planning is, and maybe first of all what strategic planning is not. So here's a cartoon, and the guy says, "I was beginning to see myself as a visionary. Turned out they were hallucinations." So the key is, when you do strategic planning, talk about the direction of organizations, talk about the future, that it's all still reality-based, that it's realistic. It's not wishful thinking, because at some point you have to implement a strategic plan. And so if you pull things together that are not under your control or influence, it will be very difficult to get there. So what is strategic planning? Here's a definition from business.com. Strategic planning is defined as a systematic process of envisioning a desired future and translating this vision into broadly defined goals or objectives and a sequence of steps to achieve them. And the process, the strategic planning process some of you have been through, is fairly straightforward. And what I do, I start out at the higher level, creating a mission and a vision first, because that tells us and gets people on the same page with respect to what is this organization all about? What are the benefits that you provide? And then where do you want to go in the future? Then from there you develop the goals, strategies, and tactics. And out of that, at the very end, we develop measures of success or metrics. I like to use the measures of success because when you talk to people about key performance indicators or metrics, sometimes there's a fear because key performance indicators and metrics have been used in the past to slam people because they're not performing correctly. So strategic planning with those elements answers the three questions that we talked about are necessary for a total performance system to be guided. So the three questions are, where are we going? How will we get there? And how will we know we have arrived? So those are the questions that are being addressed in the strategic plan. Now that we know what strategic planning is, let's look at the reasons for strategic planning. So why should organizations go through that process and create a strategic plan? So first of all, that's one thing I mentioned, is to create clarity within the organization. Everything else flows from there. Without clarity in the organization, it will be very difficult to perform optimally. It will be difficult for leaders to say, here's where we're going, to make the right decision based on the future. And it will also be very difficult for employees to know how they can contribute to the overall success of the organization. Secondly, the reason for strategic planning is to improve customer service, financial results, internal operations. Another key aspect is to prepare the organization for growth. Part of the strategic planning process looks at what it is that we need to fix right now to be able to move to our desired future. If you don't look at that, if you just say, well, we got to grow, we got to get more satellites going, or we got to just increase the number of people we serve, without looking at the underlying environmental systems or the underlying organizational systems, I will tell you it will be very difficult to move forward and grow in a way that is sustainable. Strategic planning allows you to do that. And then once you have a strategic plan, you will be able to prioritize resources based on your priorities, based on the goals that you have set. And other organizations too have to meet requirements. For example, CARV, or the Higher Learning Commission for universities, they require that as well. So when I was starting to do some work for the University of Western Michigan University in Kalamazoo, I worked with the Office of Business and Finance. The Office of Business and Finance is the arm of the university that governs everything that is non-academic. So anybody who's not faculty is underneath the Office of Business and Finance. So we started creating a strategic plan, and people said, well, the university doesn't have a plan, how can ours fit in there? And what we decided was that any organization, mission or vision or strategy would have to be broad enough to that most of the work that you do would fit underneath. And so we went ahead, but the university didn't get a strategic plan until the Higher Learning Commission went in, did a site visiting, and they dinged them for not having a plan in place. So they're finally getting there. So strategic planning, finally, is you do that to meet some requirements. So I'm sure there's other reasons as well for different organizations, but these are the ones that I'm come in contact with all the time. So what should a strategic plan look like? So I want to talk about these different ingredients, and as we talk about the ingredients, we also talk about partly what the process is like. So the first piece that should be in a strategic plan is the mission, vision, and core values. Those are typically called guiding principles. And the mission, is the starting point for any strategic planning initiative. If a leadership team of an organization is not clear on the purpose of why they exist, the benefits they provide to customers, then how can you move forward and set a direction for the future if there isn't even clarity in the leadership team? Also, a mission statement helps you to make practical decisions, especially nonprofits. It's very easy to go after some donation, or maybe to pursue a grant. That looks really great on paper because it's something maybe you wanted to do. But what I've seen before is that nonprofits go after the money, and after a few years they have services that are totally away from where the mission is. So they have this mission creep just because they followed the money. So when you have opportunities, it is really important to say, this is what we want to do, really help us further our mission, expanding this program or creating new programs. This will really help us further our mission. So that's why it's so important that the leadership team is clear on what that is. And one of the most important aspects of a mission statement, that's one thing that people here know that I harp on, is defining the benefits to the consumers or to the customers. It's one thing to say, here's what we do. The other thing is, why do we do it? And that is really the important clarity that has to be driven down all levels of the organization, the why. Because the benefits to consumers often transcend the particular services that you might provide. For example, you may provide services to individuals, but then the benefits are you have to do with quality of life and independence and all those things. You don't provide independence, but you help people to get there. Just let me make this clear from a story from a movie, The Accountant. I don't know if anybody's seen that. Interesting enough, Ben Affleck plays a young accountant who is on the autism spectrum disorder, right? So he is great with numbers, and he uncooks his books for his clients. And he's talking to this woman who's an accountant in a client firm, and they have a conversation, and she talks about her prom. And she tells how badly she wanted a $1,700 Vera Wang dress for her prom. And so Ben Affleck asks her, so why was that dress so important to you? And here's what she says. It wasn't about the dress. I just wanted to walk into the gym and have everybody say, wow, I was trying to belong. I was trying to connect. So the dress, the product that she bought, was just the means to a higher end for her. If you look at car commercials, for example, they don't necessarily tout technical specification, but you see people in nice cars going down serpentine roads way too fast, and there's a beautiful landscape behind it. Because car people, they sell independence, they sell prestige, and all that kind of stuff. So that's what we want to look at in a mission statement. What are the benefits that we're providing to the people that we serve? So let's see if this following mission statement captures that requirement of talking about the benefits that the organization provides. So this mission statement says, we systematically establish, promote, and disseminate worldwide professional standards for behavior analysis services. What sounds good is what you do, but I think we can do better than that. So here's what the final mission for the BACD looks like. We protect consumers of behavior analysis services worldwide by providing these services. Now, if you look at that, it's a totally different spin. Now you say, wow, this is really an important organization with an important purpose. And people who work for the organization or affiliated with that organization can say, wow, this is something that we need to work on because it's critical. So if you have an organizational mission statement, it's really important to talk about those benefits. Let's move on to the next piece of the strategic plan. That's the vision. So part of the guiding principles, the vision statement. King Solomon said in Proverbs, without a vision, where there's no vision, the people perish. I wouldn't say that an organization perishes without a vision, but I would also maintain, and based on what I've seen, is that you would not reach your potential if you don't have a vision. If there's no clear direction, you don't know where you're going, you will never even know if you get there. So a vision statement has to be different from a mission. Instead of being practical, it has to be more talking about the potential of the organization. It's not so much about the purpose. It should also be aspirational. And that is key. It should fire up the people that are writing it. It should fire up the people who are working in the organization, that they say every day when they go to work, I want to help achieve this vision. This is really important to us. And it's really the super goal that everything else links to. So anything that you do in your organization should help you move closer to your vision. If you do other things, then maybe you need to look at not doing those. There were some studies that were done by Kaplan Lawrence, guys from Harvard, who looked at what organizations do after they have created a mission statement, a vision statement, and they said, I'll go through all your internal initiatives, projects, and whatever other programs that you have, and see if they help you further your mission and vision. And most of them, they said, come back and have a long list, 75, 80 things, and half of them are not mission critical for helping achieve the vision. Reasons for those projects are, well, we've been doing it for 20 years, or it's somebody's pet project, or he's been working on it so long, he just can't take it away. And that's how energy gets wasted. And then people wonder why they don't have enough money to get things done. So the vision helps with that as well. It has to be aspirational. And then it's the super goal that aligns everything else. Let me just give you some examples of how visions can be formulated. So a compelling vision can have as a focus the customer. And this is an example from a CMH-related organization. And they say in their vision that children, youth, and families define, pursue, and achieve their potential. So this is really about the consumer and their customer. It's not about we want to be the best mental health agency in the state or in the world. We just want to make sure that our customers achieve their potential. So it's totally consumer focused. Here's another example of a vision that is more organization focused. This company says, we will be the leading global supplier of the highest quality and most innovative products in our field. Totally talks about who they want to become. But in either case, both statements make it clear to the people in the organization what it is that we want to achieve. Whether it's a better life for our consumers, or whether we want to be the leading supplier of these products in the field. And let me show you how you can use those vision statements practically. Let's say somebody in the organization that you work with, a peer, or maybe a direct report, does something really great. Instead of saying, for example, with the first one, that was great how you worked with a family to develop specific goals for each family member. It would be great. But what you want to do, what you want to add to reinforce the clarity created by the vision is you want to add something like, this is really helping us achieve our vision by you doing that. So you want to link that back to the vision. And that's true for any other things. When you find that somebody does something well, be able to, in your feedback, point out how it helps the organization move forward. The final element of the guiding principles, the mission vision, are the core values. Core values are sometimes called beliefs or commitments or enduring values. The label doesn't really matter. There we are. This is an example. Sometimes organizations have core values with just a number of words. Other times organizations have value statements that are more explanatory. So what I'm having here is problems with the pointer again. Sorry. All right, this is an example from a university. Instead of just saying our core values are student-focused service, community engagement, authentic dialogue, where people say, well, what does that mean? Right? So they just explained those. And Melmark, you did the same thing with your core commitments. And that's really critical, because if we say the strategic plan's purpose is to provide clarity, then by defining core values, not only do you say really what's important, but how we achieve our purposes. Because that's what core values are. They underlie everything that you do. They say in order for us to achieve our mission and vision, here are the things that we really focus on a behavioral level. We want to make sure that our behaviors meet those core values. For example, with this university, we want to make sure that everything we do is a student focus. We want to make sure that we engage the community, and so on. And if you provide the clarity with another sentence, for example, like they did here, then it can be communicated even better, because as you go down the ladder in the organization, there's less room for improvement, less room for alterations. Because we all played the telephone game, you know, so here's what somebody says, and then you communicate the values all the way down. They end up with the direct care staff or the frontline employees totally different than what the leadership had intended. So if you add some more meat to it, that's even more helpful. The next thing in the strategic plan are the goals, and those are very, very critical. I want to share with you is how to write good goals, or what to look for in good goals. Many people heard about that goals have to be smart goals, specific, measurable, ambitious, realistic, and time-bound. And a lot of organizations write goals as actions. Develop the process that is customer-focused. This example right here. So somebody may say that's our strategic goal, develop processes that are customer focused. The problem is, if you have this as a strategic goal, and I ask you in 2, 3, 4 years, have you developed a process that is customer focused? The answer is yes. So are you done with your goal? Have you accomplished that? Well, that's not really what we mean. We want to really be a customer-focused organization. So the better thing is to ask, what is the result of what we're trying to do? So I suggest that when you develop goals, whether it's for an organization or department or anything, or even for a team or for a project, look at the goals that are kind of mini visions. What it is that you want to accomplish with that goal? What is the future state that you want to achieve? So here's one way of saying that, is it is easy for our customers to do business with us. It's not saying develop processes that are customer friendly, but it's really as a result of it, we want it to be easy. And the nice thing is that if I ask you 3 years from now, 5 years from now, if you have achieved this, we're getting closer, but there's always room for improvement. We can always make it easier. So if you have strategic goals that are stated as a future state, as a mission statement, you can always use that to find other ways to improve what it is that you're already doing. You're never really done with it. So that's the key. And let me show you what, that's another example. Consumers have opportunities to excel in all aspects of their lives. It's from a human service strategic plan. So now if you have that as a strategic goal, you can always ask questions, what else can we do? What other opportunities can we provide to help our consumers? We're never really there. And I think that's really important. Otherwise, you have to change strategic goals all the time, and then you don't provide clarity because it's a moving target. So let me kind of give an example of what a goal consists of. So here's a page out of the strategic plan, the way we develop those. We try to cut out the prose and just get right into something that's really practical and useful. Because eventually, if you have a lot of sentences in the strategic plan, people, the clients, have to pull this out and make something like this out of it to be able to follow it. So first you have a goal statement. That's really critical, and that is the final, kind of like the mini vision that I talked about. And then underneath the goal statement, what you want to have is strategies that say, okay, what are some actions that we have to engage in to make sure that this goal will become reality? So that's what's being developed in the strategic planning process. So let me give you an example of what a goal could look like from this particular strategy. Revise vocational skills curriculum. So the importance here is there's an action, so strategy is an action. And what you want to do when you develop something like this is to really look at something tangible. The worst thing that can happen is that you have a strategic plan with strategies that are kind of loosey-goosey, that leave room for interpretation, because the key is to create clarity. So here, this strategy, for example, points directly to something that you can touch. It's a curriculum that is revised. You can look at it, it's on paper. Sometimes you have to make a decision. So you can say, explore creating second facility, for example. But at the end of that will be facilities plan, or at least some sort of a study. That's what I like to encourage my clients, is to make sure that when you have action statements, that there's something in there that you can eventually point to as a final product. The next part is a target completion date, or we call it target date. Not only do you have to define in a strategic plan what is that we have to do, but you also have to talk about, well, when does it have to be done? You're all familiar with human behavior, and you know, probably from your own experience, if you don't set a deadline, things just don't get done. There's other priorities that sneak in, and I've seen so many strategic plans that list goals, list some strategies, and then they're done. And then you wonder why 2 years later, there's no traction, or only a few things is what people are working on, because there's no timeline to it. So where do you fit it into the organizational calendar? You know, if you're not getting held accountable for having a deadline, well, worry about it, your plate's already full. So one key element is to make sure that there's a target date, and the second one is to talk about who is responsible. We call that the strategy owner, for making sure that the strategies get implemented. So who gets the call from Rita if she wants to find out that something gets done or not? That's the strategy owner. It doesn't mean it's the person who does it all, but it's the person who makes sure that implementation of the strategy moves forward. So these two elements are sometimes missing in strategic plans. So if you ever work on one, create one, hire somebody to work with you, make sure that those elements are part of your final deliverable, because that allows you to create clarity. Otherwise, if you don't say who does what by when, it just becomes too muddy, nothing gets done. That's the problem that I can see a lot. And the final piece on this page is a column that has a status written on it. So to encourage organizations to provide updates, because what I've seen before is people rewrite the strategic plan and put it into some sort of a spreadsheet, or they retype it, or they reuse those tables, because they have to provide updates. So we encourage organizations to just type in there on a quarterly basis, so here's where we are on this particular strategy. We're moving forward or not. And communicate those results to leadership and highlights of those results throughout the organization. People need to know that progress is being made, that we are moving forward. Because you may have a goal or strategy that may be 2 years out for a completion date, but that doesn't mean you start working on it 2 years out. You may start working on it now to see the results 2 years from now. So what you do with your updates is to let folks in the organization know things are moving forward. We're working on it. It just takes time. And we write these things. We have to write these policies and procedures. We have to do other things to get to the results that we want to accomplish. Now, the goals that I shared with you earlier, they were all kind of customer or consumer-oriented goals, mostly. However, to have a solid strategic plan to create clarity about different aspects of your system, you want to make sure that your goals are balanced. So what do I mean by that? The concept of balanced goals or balanced scorecard was developed by these Harvard professors, Kaplan and Norton, in the 1980s. They were looking at organizations, strategic plans and strategic goals, and they found that many organizations had goals really centered only around the financial performance of an organization, you know, to generate results for the shareholders. High-performing organizations had also goals that were looking at customers, internal processes, and also making sure that organizations are what we want to call a learning organization, or where learning and development is important. So what you want to do is make sure that goals are focused on the customer, finances, the process, and learning and development. Why is that? Well, if you want to serve the customers really well, you have to make sure that the processes and procedures that you have in place point to that particular goal. At the same time, you have to make sure that the people in the organization have the skills and the knowledge to implement those procedures and implement the processes or write those. And also, if you are an organization that is big on innovation, for example, you have to have people that have the skills and that at the front of the technology to be able to make those innovations. So that's why it's so critical to make sure the goals are balanced. For nonprofits like Melmark, the ultimate outcome is serving the people that you have here, the individuals and the consumers. And that is the ultimate outcome. So the money, the finances are a means to an end to achieve those outcomes. For-profit organizations, their ultimate outcome is to generate value for the shareholder. So serving customers is one step to do that. But regardless, it's important that these goals are all balanced. I was working with an organization a few years ago that was doing some research for a medical company. So they were doing non-human research, and they were growing so quickly that they were doing great, and they knew, though, that some processes within the organization were not performing as they should. And they said, we don't have time right now to stop. We don't have time to move forward. We've got to serve our customers right now. We're just going to take care of it later. What happened was that the few errors became many errors. The few delays became more delays because the process was not supporting all the work that came in. So they started losing customers because of that. And then later on, they had enough time to write those procedures because customers went elsewhere. It's like what Covey says, people say, I'm so busy driving, I don't have time to get off the freeway and get gas. And that is really, really critical. So make sure that goals are balanced. Another thing that's critical for a strategic plan is kind of like summarizing the implementation schedule. So that's not really anything new. What you're doing is you're putting together on one page the target completion dates, because you want to make sure that what you do is not all ending up in the next 6 months or next 12 months. It has to be really balanced. Let me wait till I get there. All right. That's just an abbreviated sheet. Sometimes it's several pages long, depending on how many strategies there are in an organization. But the key is that in the excitement of strategic planning and wanting to get things done, that sometimes organizations at first blush, they create target dates that are too aggressive. Everything ends up in the first year, or the first 12 months, or first few quarters. And so what you got to do is, after the plan is established, go back and make sure that you're not overloading people in the organization with trying to get things accomplished too soon. Things take time. And so creating a schedule like this is really helpful. And the point, too, is that strategic plans are living documents. Just because you said at one point we have to accomplish this by this date doesn't mean you can't change. The budget environment changes, the staffing requirement changes, you have more or less people that you're serving. So all this affects how you can implement your strategies. And another element is the measures of success, the metrics. I talked about that earlier. And here's what they can look like. It doesn't have to be complicated because we're trying to create clarity. That's a page out of a strategic plan for the Shawnee State University in Ohio. And so what we look at how can we measure progress on the mission and the vision. And we split up the metrics in two parts. We call, the middle column is called measures of success, and the right column, target. So as a measure of success, for example, when we talked about how can you tell me in 2 or 3 years that the mission was successful, and we say one of the things we know how we're successful is that the graduation program completion. Students really come to us and they graduate or they complete the program. We look at job placements or maybe graduate school placement. Those are what we call measures of success. And then once you have those in place, qualitatively talking about what does success look like, then you start looking at numbers and putting metrics to it. What I found before is if I ask people, so how would you measure success? They start talking about, well, increase this by 20% or reduce this by 10%. The key that you want to do when you set goals, set measures for anything that you work on with team members is talking about the qualitative aspect. How do we measure success? What does it look like? and brainstorm some ideas till you get to a point where you say, okay, what are the 2 or 3 most important things, and then start measuring those. One thing that organizations have to be careful with is setting targets. On the right column there are targets. Because the strategic plan creates clarity for the first time in many organizations of where they're going and measuring performance. You don't want to fall into the trap of setting up targets just because you have to. Let me give you an example. If you're developing, let's say, your organization wants to develop a new sports car. So measure of success may be how fast you're driving. The target would be the speed. The target speed would be 220 miles an hour. So the same is true for your organization. You want to look at, okay, what does success look like first? And then we put some metrics on it. If you don't have metrics or a target, just put the measure in place, start collecting data, baseline data, and then after you have gone through 2 or 3 cycles, whether it's a month or it's 6 months or a year, some measures will take a year before you can get the result, then you set your targets. Otherwise, if you're shooting too high and you don't achieve the target in the first year, for example, then it looks like failure. If you set the target too low, let's say we go by the average industry performance, then you just encourage mediocre performance. So I do that, I suggest that because the big problem is that if you don't have targets, that you just make something up that's not realistic. And then it's kind of like a stretch goal, people don't meet it, and then there's a high frustration in the organization. The next slide is very similar. This one talks about the success measures for the particular goals. And what you can do too, if the mission, the vision, or the super goals for an organization, instead of developing new metrics for every goal and the mission, I say, what are the most important measures for your particular strategic goals? And then those most important, top 3 or so, could be the ones how I measure organizational success as well. So the final piece in the strategic plan that I encourage you to put in there if you ever develop one is to put in a record of all the planning activities. Because you want to update your plan on a regular basis, and it's very easy to forget, how did we get to our mission? How did we get to these goals? What was the environment like when we created this plan? So put in those particular planning activities, and then also what you can do is when you bring in new staff members, new leadership staff, or you bring in new board members, you can say, here's how we achieved our mission and vision, how we came up with our goals based on the assumptions then. And when you update your plan, you can look at if these assumptions are still valid. So that's one thing that is a great element. So one of the things I talk about a lot is clarity throughout the organization. That everybody in the organization knows how their job contributes to the success of the overall organization. There's a story that's being told that kind of highlights this particular alignment that everybody in the organization knows why they're there. So in the early 1960s, 1961, President John F. Kennedy toured NASA for the very first time. It was shortly after he announced the goal that he wants to send a person to the moon and land them safely and bring them back and so on. And while he was touring NASA, he introduced himself to a janitor, a person who was mopping the floor. And so he asked the person, what is your job here at NASA? And the janitor replied, I'm helping bringing men to the moon. So that's a great example. He was seeing himself, not as somebody who was cleaning the floor, but he was seeing himself being essential in providing a clean environment so nothing happens as people fly to the moon, whereas they're coming back. And if you can create that kind of alignment in the organization where everybody knows, I'm here to accomplish the mission, that's when you have alignment all the way down. So that's a great example. And that's something to strive for. You may say, well, this was easy to do because the moon landing or the goal of the moon landing was all over television, everybody knew about it, that was the new goal for the country. But you have a goal. Your goal is to make life better for consumers and their families. And that is a great mission. So you got to make sure that when people that work here, no matter what their job is, that the focus is on the consumers and to improve lives. So What do you think would happen if I walked through Melmark on my tour today and I would have asked people, so what's your job here? What they have told me. Would they be able to point to the mission of the organization, or would they kind of still talk more about the job that they're doing? And so part of the implementation of the strategic plan will be to create this clarity so where people say, here's why I'm working at Melmark, because of the difference we want to make in people's lives, but also reflect the mission and the vision. So what we talked about so far was what's in the strategic plan. Now that you have one, and you do have one here at Melmark, how do you deal with it? What's the next step? The next step after you create a strategic plan is to roll it out and to communicate this clarity that you have created with the mission and the vision. So the first thing that you want to do, and I want to tell you that you've done a great job, is to create what's called a rollout plan. So yes, after you create a strategic plan, you've got to create another plan that's talking about how do we communicate the strategic plan, which is really critical because unless you communicate the clarity and have a plan for doing that, you cannot make sure that everybody in the organization understands what your mission, vision, and the goals are. It's a really a big deal to orchestrate the rollout, customize your presentations to the different audiences. And I know that you have talked to the board about it, you have introduced the plan to the families, got great feedback, you rolled it out to the staff and customized it for the different audiences. That is so critical. And I've seen strategic plan rollouts fizzle because the leadership staff did not see the important task. Maybe they would send out an email or put a newsletter, here's our strategic plan, our new mission and vision, and that was it. But everybody's seen it, but it's not. So the key to have a rollout plan. And then start by announcing plan completion. What I mean by that is people know in the organization, typically know that there's something going on, there's some planning happening, leaders have these offsites. So let folks know, yes, we have completed a plan. And then share the plan with leadership staff first, because those are the folks that will be implementing or being strategy owners responsible for the implementation. So that's really critical that they know what's in it, and also that they can review some of the assignments and say, well, this is what I have on my plate, maybe negotiate target completion dates or so on. So it's really, really critical. And because you cannot really announce the entire plan, the entire document to everybody, but everybody who cares about the details, you just want to make sure that after you share the details with leadership staff, that you also share the guiding principles, the overall goals, and success measures at departmental meetings. And the way it's been done here has been done right. It's for the CEO to go to those departmental meetings and say, here's what our new mission, our vision is, here are the goals, and share that. There's too many people in leadership positions to delegate the task. Frontline supervisors here just report that out. And if the strategic plan is not important to the top leadership, how should everybody else in the organization care about it if we don't take the time to communicate it? So that's a mistake that's made many times. And so one of the things that I've experienced before an organization is we developed a new mission and vision, and then the CEO had the mission printed out, put into these cheap little document frames, 11 by 12, 3.5 by 11 frames, and screwed to the walls of all meeting rooms in the organization. And that was the rollout of the mission. And I wasn't part of the planning process, but it is just amazing. People read it, wonder why it's there, and it's like, there's a great opportunity missed to create clarity. So leaders have to just communicate that and answer questions staff may have. However, as I said earlier, you don't need to necessarily communicate all the details of a strategic plan. What is really helpful is to communicate summaries. And this page right here shows the summary page that the Association for Professional Behavior Analysts put on their website as the strategic plan summary. There's one page with the introduction, and then this shows right here, left to right, the mission, the goals, the vision, and the core values. And that was it. That's what most people in the organization or members of APBA care for. If anybody else is more interested, they can always ask questions. But so you can see that it doesn't have to be so complicated rolling the plan out. And I think I'm going to share some slides that you already have seen, maybe for those folks who are not at Melmark. This is what you use as a summary for a strategic plan. It's just the introduction of the strategic plan, talking about why the document is important, talks about mission first, and then there's the summary of the mission, goals, and the vision, and the core values, or core commitments. But because they were so important, instead of having just the phrases there, we put in the additional page that shows what those core commitments are. So what you have here is the core commitments in the smaller boxes and then more of an explanation underneath. And I love that because, like I mentioned earlier, is as those values and commitments get communicated down to the organization, everybody else knows what these longer sentences are, what they have to be. So when managers, directors, supervisors communicate that, they have a framework for doing so. So that's a great example. And then finally, in the summary I mentioned earlier, provide information to the organization about what are the most important measures of success. How do we know that we're getting there to where we want to be? And so these are the top measures of success. There's others in the strategic plan, but these are the ones that are the most important and have the most relevance to people working here. So it's really easy to provide that sort of a summary. And the reason I'm bringing that up is sometimes leaders think, oh man, we have to communicate the plan in all its entirety, in all this detail, and it takes too much time, but it doesn't have to be all the time consuming. And this is the kind of stuff you can put on the website. You can put some of these in newsletters. It's really a great way to communicate clarity. So after you shared the summary at department meetings, let's see, you also want to share something like this with important stakeholders. We talked about sharing this with board, family members, partners outside the organization, because you can't go it alone. I tell people who develop organizations, who develop strategic plans, just because you have a vision doesn't mean that you can go alone. Share that with your suppliers, share that with your other business partners, other organizations, so they can help you get there. You can post a summary on the website. And what I encourage organizations to do as well is create posters with the most important aspects and post those around the organization during the rollout, so people are reminded of what the mission and the vision are, where we're going. And so this is about communicating clarity in the initial rollout. Here's where we are going and how we get there. You also want to reinforce clarity. That's a concept that Lencioni brings up in his book, The Advantage. So how do we do that? Through the implementation. So it's really critical. Mission, vision, and values drive the culture. So what does it look like? So you want to make sure that your guiding principles and then your values are embedded in all systems that touch humans in the organization, starting at selection of new employees. So when you hire new employees, do they share your values? Do they share your core commitments? When you do performance reviews, make sure that you also look at the values and say, how are you helping us put those values into practice and into play? People who are poor performers, if they have the right values, they can always be coached. But sometimes organizations have people who just do not live up to the values, who don't embrace the values, then maybe it's time for them to free up their future. Because if you have folks in the organization not aligned with your key values and your mission, then what they will do, they will destroy the organization. Sustain strategic focus via meeting agendas. Oftentimes meetings, agendas are just made up ad hoc, or this old business, new business. Make sure you talk about the goals that you want to accomplish. What I encourage people to do is have mission and vision on their agendas, whether it's leadership meetings or others. Bring those out. Track and report progress. That's really important, especially again with respect to reporting out. So how do people know that the work they're doing makes a difference? Just report that out and don't just track it. That's really another important message for management. And celebrate success. That is so critical. When milestones are achieved, it doesn't have to be overly complex or expensive. Sometimes just providing lunch for people, for an organization or for a team is great. Just to let folks know, I know what we're doing, I know we're working hard, we make progress. So update the plan every 6 months, yearly. make sure that the assumptions that you had at the onset are still valid. If not, maybe you have to add strategies to it. And then how do you track progress and results? Typically, you track progress often by strategy implementation. Have we implemented our strategies on time? Are they completed? Are they behind schedule? Results are more of the high-level metrics for the goals, measures of success. You report those on the mission, vision, and the goals. So, because I mentioned earlier that strategic planning implementation is a long-term process, and sometimes it takes a while to see the results. What you want to report on then is, we are working on this strategy, or this strategy has been completed, and even though it may take a while to see the actual outcomes. This is just an example, and I want to move on because we're almost out of time. It's an example of what a dashboard looks like. Sometimes organizations read about where we have to, how can we provide all the information at a glance. And I'm going to click through it pretty quickly. It's going to be in the slides if you want to get a copy. Dashboards don't have to be complicated. They have to be just tools where you can see at a glance what it is that needs to be done. And one thing that behavior analysts are good at is time series data to look at progress over time. A lot of organizations, you'd be amazed, to just report the current year data and performance and don't look at it over time. So that's not very helpful. So what are some barriers to the planning process? Now that you have a plan in place, you have communicated it. Problems are, as you develop a plan, there's too many people. Too many people take too long to develop strategic plans. Also, when you engage too many people in the planning process, what happens is people disengage. So 12 to 14 is a good number. Or you have too many planning meetings. At the time that they have a planning process, people are so glad it's over that they don't want to implement the plan anymore. I'm going to go through it pretty quickly here. Too much detail. The strategic plan is really a glorified to-do list. Just like when you make a plan for a weekend of things you have to do around the house, you don't write down all the details. You just have 2, 3, 4 highlights that you need to get done to remind you. Same in strategic plan. I've seen organizations try to create strategic plans on their own, and they put in so much detail in the planning process that they're just there when it's over, instead of considering it really a to-do list. Some organizations seek input from customers, families, or staff ahead of the game. They say, we need to know what our customers are thinking so that we know we can build strategies around it. That is a big fatal flaw because typically what customers can provide is technical input of how you maybe improve customer service, but it does not tell you the direction the organization should go on. That's the role of the leadership team to scan the environment all the time and see what's happening outside the organization, what are some trends in the industry, and build strategies around that. Customers can do that, and we've tried it in the past and it doesn't work. Doing it on your own, some organizations try to develop strategic plans on their own because if you Google strategic planning, it doesn't look all that complicated. Problem is, if you're also facilitating and you try to provide content at the same time, it's not going to work. And I had clients that developed the mission vision, never used it, spent a lot of time on it, because they said, well, we don't know if they're any good or not. So that's a pretty sad use of time. So conducting a planning process right before after leadership transition, that's also a flaw, because if people are getting out of the organization, they participate in creating a strategic plan. Problem is they won't be part of the implementation, so the new person has to do that. The new person coming in does not know the organization well enough to have to develop strategies. So what are some barriers to implementation? There's some numbers here from Forbes magazine, it's a little older. But 90% of organizations fail to implement the strategic plan because they don't communicate it correctly. They don't link strategy to budgeting. One way to do that is to make sure that you develop a strategic plan right before budget cycle. 75% of organizations don't link employee incentives to strategy. Well, anybody, you're a big analyst, so you know how complicated it might be to provide incentives in an organization to performance. So it's not easy, but if you decide to develop an incentive system, make sure it's linked to the strategic plan. 86% of business owners and managers spend less than an hour per month discussing strategy, even though it's so important to them. That's why I'm encouraging folks to have regular update meetings and discuss that as a regular leadership team meeting. Finally, and that's one of the worst ones, 95% of the typical workforce doesn't understand the organization strategy. That's a shame, because there's so much time and energy spent in creating these plans. So what I'm encouraging you to do is to make sure at all levels of the organization that you understand what the mission and the vision and the goals are, and that you can communicate those. And the role of communicating is never over for leaders. So here's something that comes from the book, The Advantage. I'm going to read it real quickly because I think it's important for leaders at all levels. As tempting as it may be, leaders may not abdicate or delegate responsibility for communication and reinforcement of clarity. Instead, they have to play the tireless role of ensuring that employees throughout the organization are continually and repeatedly reminded of what is important. And they must be on guard against contradictory and inconsistent processes that can confuse employees, against the bureaucracy that can creep into an organization when people get complacent. The key there is that as a leader in the organization, not just the top, but anybody else in the organization, that you communicate the mission and the vision all the time. You have an opportunity to remind people of what the mission and the vision are. That's really extremely critical, and it's the only cause of over-communication. And he says, if you as a leader feel tired and bored talking about the mission and the vision, that's when you have the right level of communication, because one newsletter doesn't do it, or 2 emails don't do it. It has to be constantly reinforced. It's like when you work with individuals, you have to constantly reinforce the target behaviors, and then you never really stop doing that. A couple of slides to wrap things up. Strategy is everyone's job. What that means is for leadership, keep mission, vision front and center. You also function as a barrier buster. So if people come to you and say they cannot work and develop on a certain strategy, you can work things out, there's problems, maybe policies or procedures in place that only you as leaders can change or talk about having changed. Directors and supervisors discuss and reinforce examples of behaviors that reflect the mission, vision, and values, and say, this is a great example of how you're living our core commitments in Melmark. And direct care and support staff view your role as instrumental in achieving the mission and the vision. You have the most contact with the individuals you serve. So you are really a new example showing families and others how Melmark is living the mission and the vision by the behavior that you exhibit when you work with individuals. So it goes through the entire organization. And finally, to wrap things up, just do it. So with respect to performance management, just practice giving feedback. We've talked about that. Avoid the yes but and the feedback sandwich. Behavior systems analysis, practice the performance diagnostic checklist, the HS, that I shared with you earlier, that some of you have already seen. Also complete your personal interview checklist that we did earlier when we had this activity. Go through it. I encourage you and examine it. There may be some things where you feel like, I'm kind of weak in this area, do better, and just put those things into place. Encourage safe behaviors, and with respect to systems thinking, analyze the organization, no system with the performance, with the TPS. So whether it's a department, whether it's a classroom, whether it's the entire organization, try to draw it up and say, okay, what is it that we're doing here? What are the outcomes? What are our services that we provide? It's a great way of creating clarity. And then remember, strategy is everybody's job. It's not just something that's delegated to the top management, but it's everybody. Because without everybody in the organization, strategies will fall flat on their face. Because everybody's needed to achieve the vision that the leadership has set forth. So with that, I thank you. And I know we're a little past time, but if there's any questions or comments.
I had a question. So, Peter, on the use of scorecards and the balanced scorecard in particular, where sometimes I think organizations forget that achieving scores or outcomes are very dependent on how much direct, I'm talking for human services specifically, where if you don't have a direct care staff or you're short direct support professionals, then managers are doing the work below them, like every layer is doing the work below them. And I find that sometimes scorecards are seen as the enemy because without all the positions in place, it's hard to achieve the balanced scorecard. And I think industry is a little bit different. Other industries are different than ours, where we're so dependent on human personnel to deliver a service, and that we can't not deliver at that level, and that impacts every level up in terms of scorecard. Have you in your career found any ways to address that or talk about that? But I kind of hate scorecards, but that's just me. Because I think it's so hard to achieve control of all the personnel variables that make such a difference.
Talking about cascading the goals throughout the organization for each person to have a scorecard.
Yeah, what I'm saying is sometimes scorecards, they're great goals, don't get me wrong. So for example, there may be certain achievement goals that you want to do in a timely way. And it certainly is best industry practice to do things in a timely way. But I think in human services, there's such interruptions if you have turnover or a clinical crisis that has to be dealt with that minute. So for example, and that may take days to deal with. And so then therefore, those administrative scorecards may not always be achieved because of the variability in the populations that we serve and the variability in the personnel that work with these populations. So in the scorecards, I just wonder how you control those variables to achieve outcomes.
Well, I don't think you control those variables. You just mention those as you start continuing to measure progress and say, here's why we're not making the progress that we thought we would, because we have to address some of the other things. Just like when you track the performance of individuals that you're serving, there's a dip in the performance, maybe the person was sick, or there's some other things that happen. So in the scorecard that I went through really, really quickly, the colorful thing, there's also room to address what happened in the environment if you miss a target, if you're behind in completion. So the key there is to acknowledge it and to make adjustments. If something gets pushed back, that's great. The strategic plan is a living document. So the key is to make the adjustments and then move forward and communicate why things don't move forward as planned because of what happened in the environment, so that everybody in the organization understands it.
All right, let's give thanks one more time to Peter.